do this. Go. Now we can start. Okay, so we're going to compare the two incidences that we know about Joseph and Amnon. Come on. Okay, this way you can see the slide. So first of all, the Midrash already compares the two, Amnon and Joseph. And he says, Tov lifnei Elohim malet mimena. It's a pasuk from Kohelet. And it says, Ze Yosef. V'chotei lached ba ze Potifar. So the pasuk from Kohelet says, Tov lifnei Elohim malet mimena. It talks about somebody who is able to escape a situation. And the Midrash says that's Yosef. V'chotei yilached ba. Somebody who is a sinner is going to be caught in that situation. And it says that's Potifar. Another idea, the Midrash says, Tov ze palti v'chotei ze Amnon. So the Midrash in one sentence kind of brings both Joseph and Amnon. Okay? Now, it's not exactly that the Midrash put them one against the other, but I will do that. But in the heart of the matter, we have a very strong similarity. And we're talking about a secretive gathering with a woman as a defining moment. In the story of Joseph, he's able to yimalet mimena, to escape the situation. That becomes his defining moment. And from that point, his rise starts and he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. And he's able to fulfill his dreams and all that kind of stuff. He achieved greatness. Amnon, again, secretive gathering with a woman. I'm gonna give the context in a second. Also a defining moment, but that's the beginning of his end. Okay? What's the story? The story of Joseph and the wife of Potiphar, we know. Joseph, all of the trouble with his brothers, the whole thing. Make a long story short, he ends up in Mitzrayim. Start working for Potiphar. In Potiphar's house, he achieved greatness. Potiphar lets him do whatever he wants. Potiphar's wife, she wants him. He is a good-looking guy. She wants to sleep with him. Circumstances are such that one day there's nobody home and she tries to get him to bed and he runs away. She, in order to kind of cover up her actions, she tells everybody, hey, he tried to rape me, blah, 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 whatever, all that kind of stuff. Joseph is thrown in jail and he's going to be there for a long time until Paro is going to have his dreams, and we know the story. Good. What's the story of Amnon? Amnon and Tamar. Amnon is the oldest son of David. He is the prince. He is theoretically going to be the next king. Tamar is David's daughter from a different wife. We're going to play with that. There's a whole, we spoke about that in the past, but there's a variety of opinions what's going on over there. I'm going to continue to take the approach that we took in the past, that she was not his biological daughter, but that David adopted her when he married her mother. Okay, so David, as far as I remember, had 18 wives, right? And some of them were political marriage. Tamar's mother is one of them. She is the daughter of the king of Geshur, Talmai, and that was a good political arrangement. As a package deal, she came with her daughter Tamar. Now, Tamar is a beautiful lady, young lady, And Amnon really wants to sleep with her. And she's a virgin, and he's like so obsessed that the text says that he's actually getting sick from that. He's so obsessed. Whoops, that's not good. Can you see the slide, everybody? Yes, people see the slide. Okay, no. So you guys can see the slide. I don't know what's. That's not. I don't know what's going on. Okay, let me try. I'm sure again. No, nothing happens.
There was one slide, and then there was a second slide briefly, and then there was back to the first slide.
Okay. I don't have the signal here. Yeah, they can hear us, but so they can see the stuff we can't see. What? Yeah.
Can you use your phone as a hotspot?
No. The problem is not that. The problem is different.
Okay.
Just give me a sec. I'm gonna try. Let's see if we can bring it back. Okay, everybody see that, right? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so Amnon and Tamar. Amnon wants to sleep with Tamar, and he doesn't know how to make it happen. Obviously, they are semi-siblings or whatever. It's kind of complicated, whatever. And he's got a good friend. It's actually, apparently, that's his cousin, Yonadav. And he says to him, why the long face? And he tells him the story, and he tells him, okay, I'm going to tell you what to do. You need to go make yourself as sick and ask that your sister is going to come and take care of you. She's going to cook for you a meal. And this way, okay, you're going to have your chance. It looks that Yonadav did not think that Amnon is actually going to go ahead and rape her, but rather he thought that this is going to be some sort of a way that enable Amnon to be alone with Tamar and he can talk to her. What happened is that in order also as part of the plan, Amnon goes to David and he asks for permission. David says, okay. And Tamar goes to his room. He gets rid of all the servants and he says, and then basically he rapes her. and she begs, don't do that, and doesn't help. And not only that, after he's done, he kicks her out. He doesn't even like, okay? That's the two stories. What's the similarities between the two stories? The story of Amnon and the story of Yosef. In both cases, we're talking about a secretive meeting with a woman, right? Yosef is alone at home with Potiphar's wife. Nobody's home. Same goes for Amnon. He is alone in the room with Tamar. Both victims are described as beautiful, right? Yosef, we know Yefeh Toar Vifeh Mar'eh, and also Tamar is described as very beautiful. Next. In both cases, we have explicit demand for sexual relations. Not only that, the term is shichva imi. Sleep with me. Okay? And these are the only two times in the Bible that this term appears. So it's a very, and this is something I'm going to expand on later on towards the end. Okay, the language, it's very explicit. Next, there's a euphemism later on, to be with, to describe what happened. Right? Lihiyot ima, or haya imach. But he was with you, okay, when everybody understand what was going on. Okay, so there's a euphemism, to be with. The demand is wrong. Obviously, these are the type of stuff not supposed to happen. But it's also described as hara'a hagdola hazot. This great bad thing. Okay, next. The use of the servants to validate the story. If you remember the story of Joseph, she screams to the servants and she says, look, the Hebrew slave, what he did to me. Vayanas vayazov bigdo etzli. And he even left his clothes by me. Right? And the story also of Amnon, he sends them out. Not only that, later on, he uses the servants to kick her out. But it's to validate the story. We see the same language in both stories. Hotziu kol ish me'alai. That's in the story. Again, oh my God. In the story of Joseph, it's later on, but Joseph is using that term, Hotziu kol ish me'alai. This is unbelievable. And also Amnon uses that term, Hotziu kol ish me'alai. I know, but this is like really annoying. There's nothing that I really don't know what's going on here. Guys, just give me a sec. I'm sorry again.
I don't hear anything. You're supposed to hear?
Everything stopped, but we just see the picture.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Now
I
you can
didn't
hear
know.
me.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so a son disappears in both cases. Avshalom avenges the rape of his sister by killing 2 years later Amnon. But after that, he runs away to his grandfather, the king Talmai in Geshur. Okay, but also, not only that, there's somebody disappears. Indeed, Amnon is going to die. Joseph is believed to be dead. Okay? Next. Both fathers mourn the son all those times. Vaitabel al beno yamim rabim. Almost the same language also in both cases. Both brothers had conflict with their brothers, right? Well, in the story of Joseph, we understand that Joseph has conflict with his brothers, and here it's a brother that kills a brother. Okay? The other brother begs the father to send a brother with him. And if you remember, Reuven asked Yaakov to send Benjamin and then later on Yehuda. And here also, we have a similar story. Okay. Similar language. Vayipaleh la'asot me'uma. It's well wondering that, like, it's kind of a wonder, like a surprise that something happened. Well, not really, but that's the way it is presented in the beginning. And the same language in both stories. And both stories have the element of 2 years, right? Amnon is going to be killed 2 years later, after the rape. And what happens with Yosef is going to be in the dungeon for 2 years. Okay? This element of a hachutza, going out. Amnon kicks out hachutza, Tamar, and in the story of Yosef, Vayanas hachutza. Yosef runs outside after the attempt. both David and Potiphar hear and got angry. Vayichar lo. Same language. David as the, let's call it, the man in charge. He's the father. And Potiphar is also the man in charge. He's the husband. So when they hear about what happened, vayichar lo. Okay? There's another element, being like a long face in the morning. If you remember the story of Joseph, Joseph in the jail, he sees the butler and like the two servants, right? And he said, Lama pnechem ra'im hayom. Why the long faces? What happened? And they tell him about the dreams and the whole thing, right? Same goes here. Yonadav, right? Cousin, friend of Amnon, asking why the long face? Okay. And again, we have another motif, which is the inner room, hachadra. Vayavo hachadra. It's like it's not only just a room; it's a room inside. It's like an inner room. Okay, so these are a lot of similarities. And as we always say, if there are a lot of similarities, there's a reason for that, because whoever wrote the story of Amnon and Tamar, no doubt that person knew the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, which means they made a deliberate use of those motifs to create that correlation, to create that relationship, that the reader is going to think about that. What's the purpose? We'll get there in a second. Okay. Next. But as much as we have those differences, we have the similarities, we have differences. In the case of Yosef, we have a woman who seduces a man. In the case of Amnon, as a man that seduces a woman. In the case of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, we're talking about a married woman, right? Versus Amnon, who is unmarried. And theoretically, they could get married. And that's what she asks him. And he refuses, of course. In both cases, we're talking about the prohibited relations versus potentially permitted relations with the future. In the case of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, she's married, there's nothing to discuss. In the case of Amnon and Tamar, there could be a future. Because she says to him, talk to our father, to David, lo yimna'acha mimeni. He's not going to say no. If you went to your father and tell him, I want to marry Tamar, he's going to say yes. And the Mefarshim deal with that, how that's possible, they're siblings, blah, 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 blah. This is why I said earlier that according to some of the Mefarshim, that's the approach that I'm taking here, that they were not really related. She was adopted by David. And because she was adopted, they could get married. They're not, okay, blood. Okay, next. Spontaneous versus premeditated attempt. In the case of Yosef, Vayhi hayom, circumstances are such that everybody were not home, and she saw it as an opportunity, and boom, she acted on it. What's the story of Amnon and Tamar? He had a whole plan, figure out. Okay, it's different. The result, well, with Yosef, nothing happened. In the story of Amnon and Tamar, he raped her. The victim escapes versus the victim is banished. Yosef is able to run away. Vayanas hachutza. Yosef runs away. In the story of Amnon and Tamar, she begs him to stay in the room afterwards, and he kicks her out. Next. In both cases, clothes are being used as evidence. I mentioned before that Tamar tears apart her garment, the Ketonet Pasim, as an evidence to what happened to her. And in the story of Yosef, Potiphar's wife says, that's the evidence. He left his clothes with me. Remember? Scream. Potiphar's wife scream after that. It's all fake. It's pretended. But nonetheless, Vayikra b'kol gadol, she says. She screams. Versus Tamar's really scream from authentic place. Okay. Later on, Joseph immediately thrown into jail, but Amnon is punished only later. So Joseph's punishment arrives immediately, but Amnon's punishment arrives only 2 years later. But after 2 years, Joseph will rise and Amnon will die. So these are the differences between the two stories. And now we have to deal with what's going on here. In both stories, I'd like to claim there's, let me just move that, principle that we call Maaseh Avot Siman Banim. Something that happened to the fathers is going to happen or has correlation to what's going to happen to the children. In both cases, the sons are somehow connected to the sins of their fathers and repeat the same patterns as the fathers. Let's go back to Jacob for a second. Jacob starts with the birthright, with Esau. Goes all the way back there. I don't want to go into that. We spoke about it so many times in the past, but there is a problem there, the way he got it, right? There's deception, there's deceiving there, okay? And for that action, he's being punished, what we call midah keneged midah. In the same measure that he dealt with Esau, he is being dealt. He had to go into exile in Haran. Lavan is going to cheat him, both with salary and his wives. He needs to appease Esau with gifts, right? And just like he is dealing with the consequences of what he's done back then with Esau, with the Bechorah, that's what happens to his children as well. Reuven, Yehuda, Yosef, each one of them in his own way, trying to achieve the Bechorah, the right of the firstborn. But Yosef, to be specifically in our case, right? We're not going to deal with Yehuda and Reuven today. How does Yosef trying to achieve that? By hurting his brothers, right? First of all, we see Vayaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'a el aviem. He's the snitch. He tells his father everything that they're doing wrong, the other brothers. That's number one. Number two, he really pisses them off with those dreams, telling them about the dreams, right? And because Yosef does not create a tikkun for what Jacob has done, it seems that Jacob is going to suffer, particularly in the case of Yosef. And indeed, he's going to mourn and cry for Yosef for 23 years. And specifically Yaakov, supposed to be more sensitive to that stuff because of his relationship with his brothers. Because he's supposed to be sensitive to that stuff, it's not happening. And he is careless, and that's the result.
Arik, excuse me, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Arik, you just said because he did not do a tikkun, Yosef.
Mhm.
What tikkun exactly should he have done? He was a very young boy, I think maybe 17 or so. What kind of
Yeah, I
tikkun are
understand.
you talking about at this age? I
Well,
understand later, but not now. Please tell me what you had in mind.
I think that at the age of 17, you can have healthy relationship with your siblings. I think
But
17.
what if you did not create this unhealthy relationship?
But the Torah says specifically that he is the one that created it.
Oh,
The Torah
I
says
thought the father showed tremendous favoritism, and that created a sinah between the brothers.
the father is part of the blame, no doubt about it. But the Torah says, "Vayaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'a el avihem." That's the first thing. Meaning, Yosef is the one
Who brought, yeah.
the negative report on his brothers. He should have been. I mean, yes, I'm not. That's exactly the point. It's Jacob's failure as well. But Joseph, whether it's his fault or not. Whether it's his fault or not, he continues that pattern.
I see. Thank you.
Same goes, no problem. Same goes for David. Obviously, the sins of David are worse. We're talking about forbidden relations with Bathsheba, which is the tipping point from which everything is going to go south for David, into murder of Uriah, again, the story of Bathsheba, and he also going to have the punishment of midah keneged midah. So immediately after the story with Bathsheba, Natan HaNavi comes to him, right? Remember the story? Natan HaNavi tells him,
Ish.
Atah ha'ish, but he tells him also a series of tragedies are going to be part of your life for the rest of your life. So the first immediately is the first son from the relationship with Bathsheba dies, right? Remember, we talked about that, okay? Right after birth. That's number one. But Amnon and Tamar, that story of Amnon and Tamar is the one that actually starts a whole series of tragedies for the house of Israel. Yes? So, in our case, in that case of Amnon, follows also the footsteps of his father, David. Just like David was looking at Tovat Mar'eh Me'od, at a woman who is very beautiful, i.e. Bathsheba, also Amnon is looking at Tamar, who is described as Yafa Ad Me'od, very beautiful. And also here, Amnon is going to follow the footsteps, willingly or unwillingly, it doesn't matter, going to follow the footsteps of his father. And also here we see this idea that David, whom, by the way, I'm going to put it in parentheses, where would he know that he's supposed to be super sensitive to this idea of sibling rivalry because of his own relationship with his brothers, right? We spoke about that in the past. He is completely doesn't see the picture here. And he is the one going to send Tamar to Amnon, which is going to lead to her rape, the death of Amnon, and Absalom running away to Gishur. Okay, nonetheless, the similarities end at that point. Let's look at that from a broader perspective for a second. It's part of the godly plan that Joseph is going to end up in Egypt. Not because he was sold only, because there are three, let's call it trends, or three principles, or three promises that's supposed to happen. One, Ben Abetarim. God already promised to Abraham way before Joseph was born that his descendants are going to end up in Egypt in slavery. So that had to happen. Right? Number one. Number two, It's the continuation of Jacob's punishment for deceiving Esau. Part of that is this mourning for 23 years for Joseph. Number 3 is Joseph himself. The outcome of his own actions. Yosef cannot, he doesn't have the power to avoid the other things, like what happened, what's supposed to happen, like the godly plan, the one that promised to Abraham, and the one that's supposed to happen to Jacob. However, and here's a very important principle, sha'arei teshuvah lo nin'alu, meaning the gates of repentance are never locked. What does it mean? It means even if Yosef sinned with arrogancy, which is the root of his sin with the brothers and the whole thing, here he has the opportunity to create a tikkun in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar's wife wants to be with him, and she tells him, Shichvaimi, be with me, lie with me. What is it he says? He says no, but he says 2 reasons. Interesting. 1, hen Adoni lo yada iti b'bayit, v'chol asher yesh li natan biyadi, einenu gadol b'bayit hazeh mimeni, v'lo chasach mimeni meuma ki imotach asher tishto. Let's call it social, moral reason. It's wrong. I can't do that. He's been good to me. Your husband, I can't do that. It's wrong. That's number 1. Number 2, what does he say? ואיך אעשה הרעה הזאת, הרעה הגדולה הזאת, וחטאתי לאלוהים. Religious reason. It's not only wrong, it's also forbidden. God says no. Okay? 2 reasons. But the test is not over. Potiphar's wife takes advantage of the situation, nobody's around, and Yosef is able to resist temptation here as well. And by doing that, he knows he's going to end up in jail. He knows it's going to be big trouble for him. He knows that there's no chance this is going to be like, she's going to let it go. And this is actually when he's so close to fulfill his dreams. Remember, his dreams are, I'm the ruler, I'm the big shot. And he is already like in charge of entire Potiphar's house. He is already thinks, at least, that he is on the rise. His destiny is like, it's happening. I'm already in the trajectory to success. And at that point, and he knows if he's going to say yes to her, he's going to continue up. But if he's going to say no, he's going to end up in jail. And nonetheless, he chooses jail. Because he understands that what's good and right, both morally, socially, and in the eyes of God. And by doing that, what he's doing is he detached himself from that, let's call it the circle of sin, which was part of his life up until now. He's able to take himself out of that catch-22. Let's go now to the story of Amnon. Amnon also has that circle of sin. He is the eldest of David. He is the next king. We expect him, everybody expect him to behave in a certain way as the future king. Or I'm going to say it in a different way, like Joseph back then, to resist temptation, to be able to take himself out of that cycle of sin. But what does he do, Amnon? He chooses the other way. He chooses the way of Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife had, let's call it, it was a circumstance, coincidence, right? But Amnon creates that situation. He works really hard to make it happen. And there are three, as I mentioned, like he get that plan from his friend Yonadav, it was actually his cousin. And there are three stages to that plan. One, he's going to make himself look like sick because that's going to, nobody's going to be suspicious of him. A sick person going to think about that? He's sick, leave him alone. He's like, it's the fever talking, right? Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the request that Tavot Tamar v'tavreni lechem, or the way he said, utlabev le'enai shetei lebivot, it's so strange and going to be accepted only if what? We look at that as, okay, he's sick. He doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, like, a healthy person is going to say that. He's going to say, what's wrong with you? Like, who cares who cooks the omelet? If you want omelets, the royal chef can do them for you. It's going to be fine, right? But if you're sick, that's a different story. It's like, just going to digress for a second. Like in the halacha, for example, we say, like, for chole, for somebody who is sick, we do all sorts of things. We're allowed to violate Shabbat and whatever and all that kind of stuff, even if it's not things that necessarily to directly going to keep them alive, but because we're afraid, especially in the case of somebody who's pregnant, even if they have like all those crazy ideas, we do that. Why? Because we don't want to come to the position where she's going to go so crazy that will endanger her or the fetus. Right? Okay. And number three, the third point of Yonadab's proposal is make David part of the arrangement. Because what? If David is part of it and David says okay, then Tamar cannot say no. And as I said, I don't think, and most of the Mefarshim say that Yonadav didn't think that Amnon is gonna do that. Yonadav was thinking, okay, I'm gonna help him create a situation in which they can speak in private. Nobody thought that Amnon is gonna be such a beast. But that's not the end of Amnon's actions. The Pasuk says, "Vayisna'eh Amnon sin'a gdola meod, ki gdola hasin'a asher sin'a me'ahava asher ahava. Vayomer la'Amnon kumi lechi." After the rape, Amnon hates her, and that hatred is greater than the love, so to say, love, whatever, that he had towards her before. To that point that he says to her, "Kumi lechi, get up and leave." And sending her away goes exactly against what the Torah says. The Torah says, in a case of rape, obviously it's a big no-no, but if it already happened, the Torah says, okay, the rape happened. ונתן האיש השוכב עמה להביא הנערה 50 כסף ולא תהיה לאישה תחת אשר עינה לא יוכל שלחה כל ימיו. The Torah says that man must marry her. Not only that he must marry her as a way of protecting her, obviously, he cannot divorce her ever. Ever. That's what the Torah says. It's Sefer Dvarim. So what he does here, he does completely the opposite. He's supposed to take responsibility towards her. He does exactly the opposite. Which brings us to the point here. Amnon's actions are much worse of the actions of David. In the case of David and Bathsheba, probably she came from her own will. We spoke about that, whatever. It's very difficult to say no to a king. I get it, but still, nobody forced her to come to David. Nonetheless, he feels responsible towards her. He creates a big mess because of that. Yeah, he kills her husband, whatever, all the time. But the point is that he feels responsibility towards Bathsheba, and he tries to create a tikkun, to repair it. In the case of Amnon, he refuses to recognize his responsibility. He is rude, and because of that, he's going to die. So what is the text trying to teach us here? It's a very significant message. Yosef and Amnon both acting because of a, let's call it a godly plan, predetermined plan. Right? It was destined that the Jews are going to end up in Egypt. It was part of the deal that Yosef is going to be sold into Mitzrayim and all that kind of stuff. And because, you know, he needs to end up in jail because otherwise he's not going to end up with Pharaoh and then he won't be able to bring the family, blah, 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 blah. We understand that. So there's a predetermined plan, a godly plan. But it brings the question of choices, making the right choices. And this is exactly, and here look at the bottom, what the Rambam in Hilchot Teshuvah says. The Rambam deals with that question, and he says, if God already promised Abraham that his descendants are going to be enslaved by the Egyptians, so that decree on the Egyptians already happened way before those Egyptians even were born, what do you want from them? It's not their fault. It's part of the original plan. God already decided that. Not only that, in the same way, the Torah says that the Jewish people are going to worship idols or whatever. So what do you want from them, God? You already know, you already decided that's going to happen at some point in the future. So why are you so angry? You already know that's going to happen. Here's what the Rambam says. Lefi shelo gazar al ish ploni hayadua. God didn't make the plan. God didn't create that plan for a specific person. שהיה, שהוא הזונה, אלא כל אחד ואחד מאותן הזונים לעבוד כוכבים ומזלות. אילו לא רצה, לא היה עובד. ולא הודיעו הבורא אלא מנהגו של עולם. God talks about, when God makes those decrees, it means that's the way the world works. It's called life, nature, call it whatever you want. God, you can't say, well, God, I'm sorry, you can't come, you can't blame me. I had no choice. You already said it's going to happen. God didn't say that it's going to happen to you specifically. That's the way the world operates. You, as an individual, have the choice. You can do the right thing or the wrong thing. Back to our cases. Sons of Jacob, there was a decree against them because of their father's sin. I get it. Same is for the house of David because of David's sin with Bathsheba. Nonetheless, everybody has a choice to make the right or the wrong. Joseph, just like his brother Judah, knew how to stop that circle of sin and to do tshuva. Amnon did the opposite. Not only that he followed the footsteps of his father, he continued, and therefore he was gone. That's not the only, yes. Yeah. Abraham is not punished. I'm going to quote the Abarbanel on that. That's not mine. I'm going to quote the Abarbanel. Abarbanel says it was necessary. In order to create a nation, there's a historic process that needs to happen. Part of it is tough education. It's dealing with difficulties. It's being in exile. It's going through all those stages that enable a nation to rise. We can talk about it in more in depth and perhaps in a different time. But that's basically, it's part of the Godly plan. Why they had to get stuck in the desert for 40 years, right? We just read in the Torah. Why? It's part of the plan. Because it, again, Abarbanel and many others said that, it was not really practical to take a group of slaves after a couple of weeks, bring them to the land and expect them to be successful in that land. Not possible. You need a different mentality. It's part of the educational process. Same goes here. No, you're looking at the things from your perspective today, it's hindsight. But the point is that, and the Rambam says, it's not a punishment. It's a necessary transition. It's a necessary part of education, and it takes time. It's nature. It takes time. But there's another fascinating comparison, and that's to the story of, I'm just going to move that, another rape, very famous rape in the Torah. So I'm going to compare the rape of Amnon, the rape of Tamar by Amnon, with the rape of Shem, right? Shem rapes Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov. Okay, we're all familiar with the story, right? Okay, Dinah goes out and she's seen by Shem. He takes her, he rapes her. Then he says, oh, I really love her. I want to marry her. And to make a long story short, the sons of Jacob says, like, you know what? We can do that only if you guys are going to circumcise. And they agree. After they do that, Shimon and Levi come and they kill everybody and they take their sister. What are the similarities? The man loves the woman very much. In both cases, we see Vayehavea, the same word, loves. Obviously, that's not love, but that's the terminology, right? Shem towards Dinah, Amnon towards Tamar. In both cases, the man is not operating alone. He has some help. Amnon gets the help from Yonadav, and who is speaking on behalf of Shem? Hamor, his father. He sends his father to try to create a deal, to make a deal with Yaakov. Next, the girl doesn't go willingly. Okay, in the case of Dinah, he kidnaps her. Literally, he kidnaps her, as the picture shows. But in the case of Tamar, her father tells her to, the king tells her to go. She can't really say no, right? Okay. In both cases, we're talking about there's a deception, right? The brothers of Dinah, right? They deceive the people over there in the village, Shem, and they tell them, we're going to be one nation in case, just if you circumcise. So deception here. And of course, Amnon deceives Tamar because he's not sick and he's not interested in the omelets that she's going to make for him. Both cases are stories of rape. In both cases, we're talking about, there's discussion of marriage. But we're going to talk about that in a second. We have the same language. Slept with her and tortured her. Okay, that's the way the Torah calls rape, torture. Yeah? Both cases, the same language. The woman is held against her will. in both cases. And in both fathers, they hear about it, but they don't respond. Yaakov wait until the brothers come from the field, and then he tells them what's happened. So he hears first, but he says nothing. Same going for David. He hears what happened, but he's silent. In both cases, we have the brother or the brothers that revenge, right? Absalom is going to kill Amnon, and Shimon and Levi are going to kill the people of Shechem. And the revenge in both cases is death. And we have again the same language of Nevala Asa Israel. It's a different way in the pasuk, but abomination, it's called in both cases. So these are the similarities. But what are the differences? The differences are that in the beginning of the story, in the story of Dinah and Shechem, the first thing we learn that he rapes her. What about the story of Amnon and Tamar? In the beginning, he doesn't want to do anything to her. Me'uma, nothing. Nothing. Right? So, in the beginning. Then the plan. We have a plan that was after or before the rape. Meaning, in the story of Amnon and Tamar, the plan was thought about and dealt with before the rape. In the story of Shechem, he takes her, he rapes her, then he comes and like, oh, I love her, I want to marry her, let's talk to her family, let's see what we can do about that. So it's after it was done. The request itself, marriage versus sex. Right? Amnon says, Shichvi mi. Right? And when Shechem make the request, the plea to Yaakov, Shechem beni chashka nafsho bevitchem, v'nitchatanu imachem, blah, 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 blah. We want to be in one nation. We want to, okay, it's marriage. Tamar, yes, she didn't, she was not taken against her will. She walked herself to Amnon's room. But Dinah was kidnapped. The aftermath of that, we have a repair versus, or trying to repair at least, versus creating greater damage. Amnon, after the rape, he kicks her out. It's disgusting. So he creates a greater damage. But Shechem, he tries to create a repair. He said, I love her. I want to marry her. We're going to be happy. Okay. What about that marriage? In the story of Shechem, it's not possible. They're not even Jewish. They're not one nation. It's not even possible. It's out of the question. What's the story of Amnon and Tamar? It is possible. She says to him, talk to your father. He's not going to say no. The word love, whatever that means here, appears before in the story of Amnon and Tamar, Vaye'ahavea, and the story of Shechem, it's after. Right? After we see the word Vaye'ahavea, and he loved her after the rape. The victim is held against her will after versus before the rape. Dinah is being held against her will after, and Shimon and Levi have to go and kill everybody so they can take her out of the house. But Tamar is being held there before the rape. After the rape, he kicks her out. Dinah, it says, "Vatetze Dinah lirot bivnot haaretz." Dinah went out to see what's going on. What about the story of Tamar? Tamar. Right? Rashi says, "Tnu'a babayit ve'eina yotzet lachutz." She sits home because she was so modest. She sits home and she didn't leave the house. So Dinah went out versus Tamar, who stayed indoors. The brothers saved Dinah, but in the case of Tamar, it's a brother who attacked her. And Shechem takes responsibility after the rape, but Amnon doesn't. So these are obviously the differences here. And of course, the message is very, very clear that Amnon is worse than a Canaanite like Shechem. Which brings me, obviously, even though we said that, to the last point of the class, it'll take us just a couple of minutes, actually 10 minutes. Obviously, this is not a love story. This is a story of lust, not love. And here's something that I'm dealing with for a long time, and I'm sorry if this is somebody's going to be embarrassed a little bit, but I think we can talk about that. I think that there's need to create a language, I call it sexual linguistic space, especially in the Orthodox community, that is clean, that is safe, so we can talk about sexuality. Sometimes because of so much euphemism, and if you remember, lihiyot ima, as I mentioned before, to be with her, we don't even know what we're talking about. There's so much euphemism, there's so much like, this and that is not even clear what's going on, what's the conversation. Part of the thing is language. The Rambam says what? It's deliberate. There is no vocabulary in Hebrew for a lot of those words. Why? Because it's a holy and clean language, and therefore we don't need it. So all the words that we have are borrowed from other places. But the problem is when there's no space, there's no vocabulary where you can talk freely about sexuality and in a safe and healthy, constructive, positive way, there's vacuum. And when there's vacuum, that vacuum fills up with other things. And the problem is that we do speak about sexuality and sex and all that stuff all the time. There is no, every day in the news, there's something about that, right? There's articles about rape, about harassment, discrimination, all that kind of stuff. So kids learn that what? Not about intimacy and the positive, but that sex is related to what? Hurting something. Something that is wrong. Something that has to do, that's a felony. Right? Sexual harassment, rape. And the parents don't talk to the kids about that. So the kids learn something that is negative. Then the religious world, like, our halachot and the Torah talks about sex all the time. Right? We talk about rape. Today we'll learn about rape. The arayot, the forbidden sexual relations. Lo tin'af, lo tachmod in the 10 Commandments. The sotah. All those prohibitions that we have, all that stuff that has to do. The laws of nidah, whatever. But in this particular type of conversation, we always talk about what is prohibited, what is forbidden, what is considered to be abomination, what is wrong, what's something that we need to remove ourselves from, something that is so negative. And here is another example for, negative approach or what the kids are going to hear that is negative. So they hear it in the news as something negative. They hear about it from, let's call it Jewish law. It's negative in the context. Oh, and then there's sex education in school. Right? And then they learn that what? That sex is also connected to disease, bad stuff, right? Good. So it's not only bad, it's not only felony, it's not only forbidden from a Torah perspective, it's not only prohibited and abomination, now it's also going to make me sick. And then there's another lesson. Today, you open the TV, everything has to do with somehow related to sex, right? Commercials. You want to buy a car, you see a half-naked lady, it's like, because you need to buy a car. It's the Coke or whatever, like, something to drink. It's like, whatever that is, sunglasses, vacations, whatever that is. There's always somebody half-naked, smiling, showing how wonderful that product is. What's the message? That sexuality has to do with commercialism, something that we buy, something that we, right? Not only that, everybody today has a cell phone, smartphone, internet, easy access to pornography. What do you learn? That sexuality has to do with objectification of women. The sex is something technical, meaningless, right? Not only that, in Hebrew, almost 100% of curses, I'm not gonna give like too many examples here, have to do with sex. Okay, I can give a lot of examples, and I'm gonna do it here on Zoom, but even the word metumtam, that we translate as stupid, it's not. Metumtam has to do with, is a variation of a Talmudic term called tumtum. Tumtum in the Talmud is somebody who has a flaw in reproductive organs. Okay, so what the kids learn again, that sexuality is something that is insulting, something that hurt. So it's a world of words that has to do with humiliating, with insult. And so why somebody want to be part of that world? It's all about victory and losses, right? Which brings me to the way the Torah deals with that. And I apologize, it's like already 12, but we're going to be done very soon. The Torah describes intercourse in 4 different verbs. To know, yada, right? The very beginning. Ve'adam yada et chava ishto. Now man knew his wife Eve, and then Cain yada et ishto, and Adam knew his wife again, right? Knew, to know. What does it mean to know? It has to do with understanding, has to do with perception and understanding. So taking that root, that word of knowing, connecting it to sex, tells me that there's some sort of a knowing each other, there's understanding, there's some sort of a intellectual, there's some sort of a connection there. So it connects the intellectual, the mind, the let's call it the psychological together with the physical. Okay, it's not only something technical, physical, there's some sort of a psychological, there's some sort of a connection on intellectual level as well. Because to know, to understand. If I'm with somebody that I know, it means I understand also that person. It's not only technical, right? By the way, when do we see that, those psukim? Immediately after they eat from Etz Hada'at, the tree of knowledge. Of course. Because of that, they discover that they are naked. Only after they eat from the tree of knowledge, they discover that they're naked. And so this yedi'ah, this knowledge, it's not only information, but it's also discovering human sexuality. So it takes that physical act and brings it some sort of a higher, some sort of a spiritual, at least intellectual meaning. The next verb is to letzachek, right? In the story of Yitzchak and Rivka, when they go because of the famine, they go to Avimelech, Melech Gerar. Avimelech saw Yitzchak, okay, this is, I don't know how they translate it, fondling his wife Rebecca. I don't know what it means. Okay, but that's another verb, to fond. And if you remember the story of today, Potiphar's wife says what? Reu hevi lanu ish ivri letzachek banu. Right? Potiphar's wife said, look, he had bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me. Right? So that has to do also with sex. What's the connection between sex and let's call it fond or whatever that is? Well, hopefully, because laughter and fond of each other, it's part of couple being together. It shows intimacy. It shows also something spontaneous, right? Just like laughter, something that is spontaneous. And it has to do with being free and comfortable with each other. And so the Torah describes sexual relations between people with this particular verb, it has to do with joy, with pleasure, which is positive in that context. The third verb is to cohabitate, right? Abraham, and he cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. Or about Jacob, and Jacob cohabited with her, with Zilpah, and she conceived. So it seems that lavo, vayavo el Hagar vatahar, etc., that has to do less emotional, like yada or tzachak, but because, let's be honest, not always that's the case. Sometimes it's a little bit more mechanic. Which brings us to the fourth verb, which is very different than the other three. The other three still show some sort of a connection between the two people. In the third one, shachav or lie, is totally different. We see it many, many times in the Torah, that particular verb, but it never describes the relationship between a man and his wife. Never. It's always with what we call the arayot, the forbidden sexual relations, or other type of things that you're not supposed to do. For example, the daughters of Lot. Remember Lot, the daughters of Lot, they sleep with their father. And the elder one went in and lay with her father. Or in the story of Avimelech, one of the people might have lain with your wife. Obviously, that's a big no-no. Or in the story of, we just read about Shechem. Vayarot Hashem, I'm in the third one. Vayarot Hashem ben Chamor achiv nisi haaretz, vayikach ota, vayishkav ota, vayanea. Obviously, that's not, shows great intimacy. And also the fourth one, kol shochevim behema mot yumat. Anyone who lies with an animal, right? So obviously that's totally different category, that verb or line. So, ladat, letzachek, lavo, to know, to fond, to cohabitate, talks about some sort of a connection, some sort of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, psychological, spiritual, emotional connection, something, but shachav, to lie, zero, something totally different, only physical. And I said that verb never describes the relationship between a man and his wife, except for one time. Look at the bottom here. It's the story of the Dudaim. Remember the story? Jacob is married to both Leah and Rachel. He prefers to be with Rachel and not with Leah. No, the Dudaim. Yeah. So Reuven goes and he finds that fruit, the Dudaim, whatever that is, and Rachel wants to have the Dudaim, and she makes a deal with Leah. She says to her, I want those Dudaim, and she says to her, not only that you took my husband, you're going to take also the Dudaim that my son found in the field. And therefore, Rachel says, Lachen yishkav imach halayla tachat Dudaim benich. So basically, she make a deal, she make a transaction that Jacob is going to sleep with you tonight, i.e. with Leah, and give me the Dudaim. That's the only time that we see, and indeed Yaakov is with Leah that night, but that's in a very negative way. It's because of a transaction over the fruit. Nothing to do with connection, nothing to do with they wanted to be with each other. There's no, it's a business transaction. So, every time that there's this idea of something that is just physical, it's described in that verb. And I found this amazing Rashi that appears here on the top that is just fascinating. Rashi in Masechet Nedarim says, even between married people. Okay, let's read the Rashi. He talks about Bnei Shichvut, meaning a person that sleeps with his wife when he's drunk. שמשמש בשכחותו דביעתו לאו ביעה גמורה, אלא כביעת זנות היא שאין מתכוון אלא לבעול בעלמא. Rashi says, even between a husband and a wife, if one of them is, he talks about the husband in that particular case, but it could be either way, is drunk, it's not considered to be that holy union. Because when you're drunk, you can't be there for the other one. You're there for your own needs only. And he calls it bi'ad znut, like a prostitute. Husband and wife. No problem. Halachic issues, blah, 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 blah. Everything is fine. Still, Rashi calls it bi'ad znut. Why? Because he's drunk. What does it mean? Mentally, psychologically, spiritually, call it whatever you want, emotionally, he's not there. He's drunk. So what did we learn? From the news, we learned that sexuality has to do with violence. From sex ed, we learned that what? Sexuality has to do with disease. From the religious sources, we learned that sexuality has to do with abomination and prohibited things. From commercials, we learned that sexuality has to do with monetary transactions. From pornography, we learned that sexuality has to do with objectification. From the curses, we learned that sexuality has to do with an insult. And from the slang, talking about Hebrew, at least, also in English, we learned that sexuality has to do with humiliation. And from the, what we call allegedly, at least politically correct conversation that has to do with sexuality, we learn that it's just a technical term. It's just, because that's what we use. Just the poal, that's the root of shachav. We don't use the other verbs. We don't use lavo. We don't use to know in that sense, I think. Not in English and not in Hebrew. Not anymore, at least. Right? So In other words, we don't give our children even any chance for a healthy way to deal with that because of the lack of vocabulary. They don't understand that there is a connection between sexuality and intimacy and mutualism, between sexuality and commitment, between sexuality and holiness. And therefore, we must create that linguistic space in which there's a discussion, fruitful, serious discussion about sexuality, which is safe, open, and worthy of discussion. This is one of my biggest problems, both as somebody who is concerned about language and somebody who is has got little kids and think about those things. So I'm just going to do that just a second.